Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you enjoy relaxing deep dives into history, psychology, philosophy, and beyond. Your support helps us continue making these long-form videos that you can fall asleep to or simply enjoy during quiet moments. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. We love seeing just how far our community reaches across the world. Let's begin our journey. In the vast, wind-swept steppes of Central Asia, where the sky stretches endlessly and the grasslands ripple like a sea under the weight of the wind, a boy named Temujin was born in the year 1162. His birth was said to coincide with a drop of blood clutched in his hand, a sign, many believed, of the warrior he was destined to become. Temujin was born into the Borjigin clan, a noble family within the Mongol tribes. But nobility did not guarantee comfort or stability. His father, Yesugei, was a powerful chief who had forged alliances with neighboring tribes. However, Mongol politics were treacherous. When Temujin was just 9 years old, his father was poisoned by rivals while returning from arranging a marriage for his son. With Yesugei's death, the family's allies abandoned them, and Temujin, his mother Hoelun, and his siblings were left to fend for themselves. This betrayal and sudden descent into poverty marked Temujin's early life with hardship. He and his family survived by foraging, hunting small game, and enduring the harsh winters with little protection. The brutal conditions forged a resilience in the boy, one that would later mirror the unstoppable force of his armies. Temujin's mother, Hoelun, was a figure of immense strength and pride. She instilled in her children the value of loyalty, unity, and cunning. From her, Temujin learned to lead, not through inheritance, but by merit, courage, and unwavering resolve. Even as a child, he showed signs of charisma and intelligence, quickly earning the respect of those around him. But the early years were not without conflict. Temujin's half-brother, Bekta, challenged his authority as head of the family. The feud culminated in Temujin killing Bekta, an act that, while grim, solidified his dominance and showed that even at a young age, he would not tolerate threats to his leadership. As he grew, Temujin began to build alliances. His friendship with Jamuka, a fellow Mongol noble, was one of deep brotherhood, two boys dreaming of uniting the fragmented Mongol tribes. Yet, as history often shows, friendships can become rivalries when power is at stake. Temujin's first major turning point came with his marriage to Berta, a woman of the Ongirat tribe. Berta was more than a spouse. She was his partner, his confidant, and his inspiration. Their union brought a vital alliance, one that would bolster Temujin's standing. But this alliance was soon tested when Berta was kidnapped by the rival Merkit tribe. Temujin, with aid from his growing band of followers and allies, including his childhood friend Jamuka and the powerful Khan Togrul, launched a daring rescue. Berta was recovered, but the event left an indelible mark on Temujin's psyche. It reinforced his belief that no tribe, no matter how powerful, should be allowed to prey upon others without consequence. Temujin's military career began to take shape. His strategies were not born merely of strength, but of flexibility, speed, and innovation. He adopted the decimal system for organizing troops, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, a system that gave his forces structure and adaptability. He promoted soldiers based on merit rather than birth, breaking with Mongol tradition and drawing fierce loyalty from those who served him. By his early 20s, Temujin was no longer just a clan leader. He was a rising force. His reputation for justice, generosity, and military skill spread rapidly. But so did tensions with Jamukha, who had begun to see his old friend as a threat. The two clashed in a bitter civil war that would define Mongol politics for years to come. In the Battle of Dalan Baljut in 1187, Temujin was defeated by Jamukha. The aftermath was brutal. Jamukha executed 70 of Temujin's followers by boiling them alive. It was a warning, a message to any who dared challenge the old order. But Temujin was not deterred. He retreated, rebuilt, and re-evaluated. He forged new alliances with disenfranchised clans, promising them equality and stability under his rule. His vision was not of a simple tribal chiefdom, but of a united Mongol nation, one that could stand against any enemy, internal or external. By 1206, after nearly 2 decades of warfare, diplomacy, and survival, Temujin emerged as the undisputed leader of the Mongol tribes. A grand assembly, or Kurultai, was held on the banks of the Onon River. There, he was given a new name, Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. It was more than a title, it was a declaration. The age of scattered clans and constant infighting was over. A new era had begun, and with it, the Mongol Empire would rise like a storm on the horizon. The coronation of Genghis Khan in 1206 marked the birth of one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. But unifying the Mongol tribes was just the beginning. Genghis Khan's ambitions reached far beyond the steppes. His mission was clear: to bring order to a chaotic world through conquest and discipline. And for the first time, the Mongols were not merely reacting to threats. They were actively reshaping the world around them. The newly formed Mongol Empire was a marvel of organization. Genghis Khan implemented reforms that modernized Mongol society in ways few would expect from a nomadic culture. He introduced a written script for the Mongolian language, based on the Uyghur alphabet. This allowed for more effective communication across his growing territory and helped preserve laws, commands, and history. He created a legal code known as the Yasa, a set of laws that emphasized loyalty, discipline, and order. The Yasa was unwritten and secret, known only to the ruling elite, but its influence was felt across the empire. It prohibited theft, betrayal, and disobedience. It punished those who lied, mistreated others, or hoarded wealth. And it promoted religious tolerance. a policy that would distinguish the Mongol Empire from many others. Religious tolerance was not simply a tactic, it was a principle. Genghis Khan believed in the power of the divine, but he did not seek to impose one belief system over another. In fact, he often consulted shamans, Muslims, Buddhists, and Christians alike. In his view, the gods of all people had value, and unity could only be maintained by respecting those values. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan was preparing for war, not out of greed, but from a calculated sense of necessity. The Mongols were surrounded by powerful neighbors: the Western Shia to the south, the Jin dynasty to the east, and the Khwarezmian Empire to the west. These empires had long treated the Mongols as inferior, dismissed them as unruly barbarians of the steppe. Genghis Khan would prove them wrong. His first major campaign was against the Western Shia, a kingdom in northwestern China. In 1209, he led his forces across the Gobi Desert, launching a surprise assault that overwhelmed the Xia capital. The Xia emperor submitted and offered tribute, buying temporary peace. But Genghis Khan's eye was already turning eastward, toward the powerful and arrogant Jin dynasty. The Jin controlled a vast and wealthy region of northern China. They had long been a dominant force in East Asia and had once considered the Mongols little more than a nuisance. That perception changed dramatically in 1211, when Genghis Khan launched a massive invasion. His army, disciplined and mobile, outmaneuvered the heavily fortified Jin positions. Using a combination of psychological warfare, siege tactics, and strategic brilliance, he struck fear into cities before even arriving. His generals, particularly Subutai and Jibe, were masters of reconnaissance, deception, and timing. In one campaign, the Mongols bypassed strongholds entirely, striking deeper into Jin territory to sever supply lines and force surrenders. In another, they used flaming arrows and fire bombs to set siege engines and city gates ablaze. The Mongol siege of Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, was long and brutal. After months of resistance, the city fell, and the Jin emperor fled south. By 1215, northern China was effectively under Mongol control. It was a staggering achievement, considering the cultural and technological superiority the Jin had long claimed. The Mongols, once seen as scattered horsemen, had evolved into the most feared army in the world. Yet Genghis Khan was not content. Victory in the east only emboldened him. Now, his attention turned westward, to the Islamic world and the rising Khwarezmian Empire. The Khwarezmians controlled a sprawling territory across modern-day Iran, Central Asia, and parts of the Middle East. Genghis Khan, ever pragmatic, initially sought peace. He sent a caravan of merchants with offerings and gifts, proposing open trade between the two empires. But the Shah of Khwarezm, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, saw this gesture as weakness. He accused the merchants of being spies and had them arrested, tortured, and executed. It was a fatal mistake. Genghis Khan responded not with another delegation, but with an invasion force. In 1219, the Mongols crossed the Sirdaria River and began one of the most devastating campaigns in history. City after city fell: Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, each a jewel of Islamic civilization, reduced to ashes. Genghis Khan's retribution was not merely military, it was total. At Bukhara, he entered the mosque, stood before the people, and declared, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." These words became etched in history, a testament to the wrath that could follow betrayal. But even amid destruction, there was order. Skilled artisans and scholars were spared and relocated to serve the Mongol cause. Engineers, doctors, scribes, they were brought back to Karakoram, the Mongol capital, to contribute to a growing multi-ethnic empire. This system of forced migration would help spread knowledge, technology, and culture across Eurasia. The Mongol victory over the Khwarezmians not only solidified Genghis Khan's legend, it opened a corridor of conquest all the way to Europe. But the great Khan was not driven by conquest alone. He believed that the chaos of the world could only be tamed through discipline, vision, and ruthless resolve. By the early 1220s, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Yellow River to the Caspian Sea. No force had moved so swiftly or so decisively. Yet Genghis Khan did not rule through terror alone. He ruled through a system, one that promoted merit, punished corruption, and rewarded loyalty. And though the world trembled at the sound of galloping hooves, within the empire's heart, a strange peace began to grow, a unity forged not by blood alone, but by an emerging dream of order in a world that had long known only chaos. To understand the expansion of the Mongol Empire, one must delve into the heart of what made their rise possible, their unparalleled military strategy. The Mongols were not simply warriors on horseback, they were masters of intelligence, organization, adaptability, and psychological warfare. Their methods reshaped how battles were fought, and their tactics remain studied to this day. At the core of the Mongol military system was the horse. Mongol horses were small, hardy, and tireless. Each warrior maintained multiple mounts, allowing them to switch between horses and travel vast distances without exhausting a single steed. This gave the Mongol army an astonishing range and speed, capable of covering over 100 miles in a single day, something that bewildered and terrified their enemies. Their use of the composite bow gave them a deadly advantage. These bows, crafted from wood, horn, and sinew, were smaller than the longbows used in Europe, but far more powerful. Mongol archers could fire accurately while riding at full gallop, a skill honed from childhood. Combined with relentless mobility, this allowed them to unleash a rain of arrows before the enemy could even respond. The Mongol army was structured with military precision. The decimal system, units of 10, Arban, 100, Zun, 1,000, Mingan, and 10,000, Tumen, created a flexible and scalable organization. Each level had a leader, often chosen for ability rather than lineage, and strict discipline was enforced. Loyalty was absolute. Deserters were executed, but bravery and innovation were richly rewarded. This meritocratic system meant that commanders like Subutai and Jebe, who began with little, could rise to legendary status through their talent alone. Genghis Khan understood that warfare was not only about combat, it was about preparation. Spies and scouts were deployed far ahead of any campaign, gathering maps, assessing terrain, estimating enemy numbers, and even spreading disinformation. Entire invasions were shaped months in advance, with every move calculated. One of the most terrifying aspects of Mongol strategy was their use of feigned retreats. They would pretend to flee, luring enemies into pursuit. Once the enemy broke formation, the Mongols would wheel around and strike with devastating force. Time and again, this tactic turned sure victories into crushing defeats for their adversaries. They also perfected the art of the encirclement, where entire armies were surrounded and systematically destroyed. At Samarkand, for instance, the Mongols pretended to be a smaller force, drew the garrison out, and then ambushed them with hidden troops positioned in the surrounding hills. Siege warfare was another domain where Mongols adapted quickly. Initially inexperienced with attacking fortified cities, they learned from Chinese, Persian, and Arab engineers, many of whom were captured or spared specifically for their skills. The Mongols built siege towers, catapults, battering rams, and used early forms of gunpowder weapons. They dug trenches, diverted rivers, and isolated cities until they collapsed from within. Their psychological tactics were no less effective. They cultivated a reputation for unstoppable brutality. Cities that resisted were razed, populations massacred, and the ruins left as grim warnings. But those that surrendered quickly were often spared and absorbed into the empire. This carrot and stick approach forced many cities to submit before a single arrow was fired. The Mongols used intimidation as a weapon. Before sieges, they would send envoys offering surrender. If refused, they sometimes released a few survivors from previous cities to recount the horrors of what awaited. Terror, in Mongol hands, was a tool of efficiency. Yet, even in war, Genghis Khan demanded discipline. Looting was forbidden until after victory. Soldiers were expected to share spoils equally, and commanders who disobeyed were punished. This created a bond among troops, where victory benefited all, and unity was more than a slogan. It was survival. Genghis also instituted a postal relay system called the Yam, which not only allowed rapid communication across the empire, but also acted as a form of military logistics. Stations with fresh horses and supplies were placed every 20 to 40 miles, enabling messages and commands to travel faster than in any other part of the world. As the Mongol army swept across Asia, its reputation grew into myth. Cities fell without resistance. Kingdoms submitted without battle. The world was unprepared for this new kind of warfare, mobile, precise, brutal, and guided by a central intelligence unmatched by any other force of the age. But the Mongol war machine was not simply a matter of power. It was strategy refined through centuries of hardship, honed by a leader who understood that order, discipline, and adaptation would always outlast arrogance. As Genghis Khan looked westward toward the Caucasus and beyond, the world held its breath. For in the dust of every hoofprint, in the silence before every charge, the message was clear. Resistance would not just be futile, it would be fatal. Beyond tactics and logistics, the Mongol military was deeply grounded in a code of loyalty and communication that held it together even during the most complex campaigns. Orders from Genghis Khan could be relayed hundreds of miles in a matter of days, thanks to the efficiency of the YAM system. This interconnectedness meant that even armies separated by vast distances could act in coordinated unison, a capability nearly unheard of in the medieval world. Another innovation was the use of multiple coordinated armies, each maneuvering independently but with a common objective. During the campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire, Genghis Khan split his forces into several columns. One attacked from the north, another circled around to the south, and a third moved directly toward the heart of the empire. This created confusion, overwhelmed enemy defenses, and ensured that resistance was fractured and ineffective. When it came to intelligence gathering, the Mongols excelled through what we would now call human intelligence networks. Before any invasion, they sent out merchants, envoys, and scouts disguised as travelers to gather information about city defenses, population sizes, terrain, and political rivalries. This information was meticulously analyzed, and campaigns were designed with precision that often left their enemies reeling. Perhaps one of the most overlooked strengths of the Mongol military was their logistical prowess. Although they came from a nomadic background, they mastered the art of sustaining large armies far from home. Mongol warriors traveled light, with dried meat, fermented milk, and blood drawn from their horses in emergencies. They could endure where others would perish. Their supply lines were simple, mobile, and efficient. Rather than rely on slow-moving carts, they used pack animals and temporary depots, often sourcing supplies locally through conquest and tribute. Culturally, the Mongol warrior ethos was rooted in adaptability and humility before the mission. Commanders could not allow personal pride or inflexible thinking to guide their strategies. Genghis Khan demanded that his generals study the ways of foreign armies and constantly evolve. After facing Chinese siege warfare, the Mongols began incorporating Chinese engineers and techniques into their own methods. In the West, they would later adopt Islamic military engineers, learning to breach stone fortifications and construct advanced siege machines. The Mongol army was also remarkably egalitarian for its time. Warriors of humble birth could rise through the ranks purely on merit. This meritocracy created fierce loyalty among troops, many of whom were bound to Genghis Khan not by kinship, but by shared purpose and opportunity. This sense of unity allowed the Mongol army to function as a single organism, deadly in its coordination and resolve. A crucial element of their psychological dominance was reputation. Genghis Khan deliberately allowed news of his conquests to travel ahead of him. Refugees from destroyed cities carried tales of Mongol savagery, often exaggerated, which caused many towns to surrender without a fight. This saved lives on both sides and conserved resources for future battles. Fear in the Mongol arsenal was just as effective as arrows. One of the most chilling tactics was the use of prisoners as human shields or cannon fodder during sieges. Captured enemy soldiers were sometimes forced to fill in moats or march ahead of the Mongol troops towards city walls, absorbing the first wave of defensive attacks. This strategy not only protected Mongol warriors, but also devastated enemy morale. The Mongols also engaged in information warfare, a primitive but effective form of propaganda. They forged letters, spread rumors, and infiltrated enemy ranks to sow confusion. Before attacking a city, they might send a message claiming an overwhelming force was on the way, when in fact only a small detachment was nearby. This led to cities panicking, leadership fracturing, and defenses being weakened before the real assault even began. Ultimately, what made the Mongol military unique was not just its ability to destroy, but its ability to transform. Genghis Khan wasn't merely a conqueror, he was an engineer of war. He redesigned what it meant to build an empire through force, by combining the ancient skills of the nomadic steppes with the evolving sciences of siege and diplomacy. The world had never seen an army so versatile, so relentless, and so cohesive. Every campaign refined their methods. Every enemy taught them something new. And through it all, the Mongol war machine rolled forward, reshaping the map of the known world one thunderous charge at a time. By the early 1220s, the Mongol Empire had already conquered large swaths of Asia, stretching from the Yellow Sea to the Caspian. But Genghis Khan was not finished. He saw beyond the borders of the known world and sought to explore and dominate lands that even his most trusted generals had only heard of in whispers. Lands to the west, where cities were built from stone and kingdoms ruled by monarchs thought themselves untouchable. It was during the campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire that the door to Europe first cracked open. Genghis Khan dispatched a reconnaissance mission led by two of his finest generals, Subutai and Jebe, both of whom had already proven themselves through brilliant military campaigns. This was not an army of conquest, but a probing expedition, a test of Europe's strength, will, and terrain. Their route was extraordinary. The Mongol army crossed through Persia, swept into the Caucasus, and clashed with the Kingdom of Georgia. Their appearance stunned the Georgians, whose forces were well trained but entirely unprepared for the mobility and tactics of the steppe horsemen. The Mongols defeated them swiftly and moved on, taking careful notes of defenses and geography. The generals then turned northward, entering the steppes of modern-day Ukraine. There, they encountered a coalition of Russ's principalities, fragmented, often feuding Slavic states, centered around cities like Kiev, Novgorod, and Vladimir. Though these lands were unfamiliar to the Mongols, they resembled the divided tribal structure of the Mongols' own past, ripe for exploitation. At the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, Subutai and Jebe delivered a masterclass in deception and timing. Pretending to retreat, they led the Rus coalition deep into the steppes, where the Mongols turned and struck with overwhelming force. The Rus army was annihilated, Their leaders were captured, and according to chronicles, some were executed by being crushed under wooden platforms, while Mongol generals feasted on top. This victory sent a chilling message. The Mongols were not just an Eastern phenomenon. They had reached Europe, and they could not be stopped. Still, the expedition returned east. Genghis Khan's attention was now divided. In 1227, he launched a final campaign against the Western Xia, who had shown disloyalty despite earlier submission. The campaign was swift and merciless. The Xia capital was destroyed and the dynasty wiped from history. It was during this campaign that Genghis Khan died. The exact circumstances of his death remain shrouded in mystery. Some accounts say he fell from his horse. Others claim he died of illness or injury. In true Mongol fashion, the location of his grave was kept secret. Legend says his funeral escort killed anyone they encountered on the journey to his burial site, then were themselves killed to preserve the secret. Even today, no one knows where Genghis Khan is buried. His death marked the end of an era, but not of Mongol conquest. Genghis Khan had laid the foundation of an empire that would continue to expand for decades under his descendants. His third son, Ogedei, was chosen as Great Khan, following a carefully structured line of succession. Ogedei had been groomed for leadership. Unlike his father's fiery temperament, he was pragmatic, diplomatic, and focused on consolidation. Under Ogedei's rule, the Mongol Empire entered its golden age of expansion. Ogedei's first goal was to complete the conquest of China, particularly the Jin dynasty, which still controlled parts of the north. The campaign was methodical. Mongol armies surrounded Jin cities, cutting them off from trade and reinforcements. The Jin fell in 1234, and northern China came fully under Mongol control. But the greatest ambition lay to the west. In 1235, Ogedei convened a Kurultai, a council of Mongol nobles, to plan a massive invasion of Europe. At the head of this new invasion was Batu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, alongside the aging yet brilliant Subutai, now a veteran of dozens of campaigns. Together, they would lead the greatest expedition the West had ever faced. The invasion began in 1236 with a campaign against the Volga Bulgars and the remaining Rus' states. Cities like Ryazan and Vladimir were reduced to ashes. Kiev, the jewel of Eastern Europe, was besieged in 1240 and destroyed after fierce resistance. Survivors spoke of fire and blood, of skies dark with arrows and buildings swallowed by flame. The Mongols moved like a storm across the continent, unstoppable and unknowable. They had no capital to strike, no palace to negotiate with. They fought in silence, never revealing their numbers, always one step ahead. In 1241, the Mongols reached Poland and Hungary. At Legnica, they defeated a coalition of Polish, German, and Templar knights. At Mohi, they crushed the Hungarian army in a brutal, meticulously executed battle. Europe stood on the brink of collapse, and then they vanished. The sudden withdrawal remains one of history's great turning points. Why did the Mongols, with the heart of Europe laid bare, retreat? The answer lies in the east. Kublai Khan had died, and Mongol custom required all princes to return for the selection of a new great Khan. Batu, though tempted to continue, knew that internal unity was paramount. He withdrew, taking his army back across the steppes. Europe had been spared, but not by might, by tradition. In the aftermath, the psychological impact of the Mongols haunted Europe. Chroniclers describe them as instruments of divine punishment. Popes and kings sent frantic letters, trying to understand the invaders or plead for mercy. But the Mongols had moved on, leaving behind only ashes and memory. The Western world would never forget the year the sky darkened with hooves and the Mongol banners flew on European soil. Part 5, Part 2. The withdrawal from Central Europe in 1242 left much of the continent in shock, but it also left an important legacy. The Mongols had demonstrated not only their military prowess, but also their capacity for administration and diplomacy. Though their armies receded from the heart of Europe, the Mongols remained deeply involved in European affairs for decades to come. Following the retreat, Batu Khan established the Golden Horde, a semi-autonomous khanate based along the Volga River. It controlled much of Eastern Europe, including the Rus principalities, parts of the Caucasus, and steppes stretching into modern-day Kazakhstan. While Batu did not return to pillage further west, his domain kept Europe under close observation. The Rus' states were now tributaries to the Mongols. They paid taxes, offered military support, and were required to seek approval for major decisions. Though this period is often seen as one of oppression, it also laid the groundwork for the eventual centralization of power in Moscow, a city that would rise under Mongol patronage before ultimately turning against them. Back in Karakorum, the Mongol capital, a new era was beginning. Following a brief power struggle, Genghis Khan's grandson, Mongke, became Great Khan in 1251. Mongke was a serious and capable leader who saw the empire not just as a military force, but as a world-spanning system that needed administration, infrastructure, and law. Under Mongke, the empire focused on two main objectives: the final conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China, and a new campaign into the Middle East. For the latter, he chose his brother Hulagu to lead the charge. Hulagu would go on to create one of the most fateful branches of the Mongol Empire, the Ilkhanate in Persia. Hulagu's army was immense. As it moved west, it swept through Persia and into Mesopotamia. In 1258, the Mongols reached Baghdad, then one of the most culturally rich and scientifically advanced cities in the world. It was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, a center of Islamic learning and governance. The siege of Baghdad marked a cataclysmic moment in history. The Mongols surrounded the city and demanded surrender. When the caliph refused, they launched a devastating assault. After the walls fell, the Mongols poured into the city, slaughtering tens of thousands. The Tigris River was said to run black with ink from the destroyed libraries and red with the blood of scholars and civilians. The House of Wisdom, home to centuries of learning, was obliterated. This event effectively ended the Islamic Golden Age and shattered the Abbasid Caliphate. It shocked the Islamic world and reshaped the political map of the Middle East. From the ruins, Hulagu established the Ilkhanate, ruling over Iran, Iraq, and parts of Anatolia. Yet, the Mongols' advance was not unchecked. In 1260, they faced a coalition of Muslim forces led by the Mamluks of Egypt at the Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine. For the first time, a Mongol army suffered a decisive defeat in open battle. The Mamluks, with their own cavalry and organizational skill, proved that the Mongols were not invincible. This battle marked a critical turning point. It halted Mongol expansion into North Africa and preserved the Islamic presence in the Levant. But more than that, it revealed a new reality. The Mongol Empire, once a united juggernaut, was beginning to fragment. The sheer size of the empire had created logistical and political fractures. Each branch of the family now controlled vast territories. The Yuan dynasty in China under Kublai Khan, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Golden Horde in the West, and the Ilkhanate in the Middle East. While they all technically owed allegiance to the Great Khan, their unity was beginning to fray. The Mongols now faced a new kind of challenge, not from enemies, but from within. Disputes over succession, cultural differences, and logistical limitations began to strain the bonds that Genghis Khan had so carefully forged. Despite these fractures, the Mongol presence across Eurasia brought about a unique moment in history, a globalized century before globalization. For the first time, a merchant from Venice could travel all the way to China using a relatively secure network of roads and rest stops. One such traveler was Marco Polo, whose journey to the court of Kublai Khan in the late 13th century would become one of the most famous travelogues in history. His stories introduced Europe to Chinese inventions like paper money, coal, and complex administrative systems, but they also showed the enduring stability of Mongol rule, how roads were safe, cities were thriving, and ideas flowed freely across borders. The Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace, was not merely a temporary military phenomenon, it was a civilizational event. Cultures that had once remained isolated now encountered each other. Silk from China, spices from India, steel from Damascus, and maps from Persia all moved across trade routes, protected by Mongol law. But even as the trade flourished, the seeds of disunity grew. And as the 13th century came to a close, the great empire of Genghis Khan stood at a crossroads, a patchwork of khanates, still mighty, still feared, but no longer a single, unbreakable force. As the Mongol Empire entered the latter half of the 13th century, a new figure began to rise, one who would take the vision of Genghis Khan to unprecedented heights, but also reshape it in ways that would signal the transformation of the empire itself. That figure was Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan and the son of Tolui. While his cousins governed other regions, Kublai set his sights on the richest and most populous prize of all, China. At the time, the Song dynasty controlled southern China, and had managed to avoid Mongol domination, even as the Jin dynasty in the north had collapsed. Kublai's campaign to conquer the Song was not only a military endeavor, it was a political and cultural project. He understood that to rule China, he would need to be seen not merely as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate Chinese emperor. In 1260, following the death of his brother Mongol Khan, Kublai was declared Great Khan by his faction. However, this was contested by his cousin, Arik Boka, who had support from traditional Mongol elites in the steppe. What followed was a civil war, the first of its kind in Mongol history. For 4 years, the two factions fought for supremacy. Kublai emerged victorious in 1264, but the consequences were far-reaching. The war had shattered the already fragile unity of the empire. The Chagatai Khanate and Golden Horde would now act with growing independence, and the empire would never again be governed by a single, unquestioned authority. With the steppe behind him divided, Kublai turned fully toward China. He moved his capital to what is now Beijing, then called Dadu, and in 1271 he formally declared the establishment of the Yuan dynasty. This was a monumental moment. Kublai became the first non-Han emperor to rule all of China. By embracing Chinese governance, Confucian court rituals, and administrative systems, he sought to embed Mongol power within the framework of Chinese tradition. The final conquest of the Song took several years. The Mongols faced not only well-defended cities, but also formidable naval resistance. Kublai invested heavily in building a navy, an unusual move for a nomadic people of the steppe. Battles were fought along rivers and coastlines, with the Mongol-led Yuan forces gradually pushing southward. In 1276, the Song capital of Hangzhou surrendered, and in 1279, after the Battle of Yamen, the last Song resistance was crushed. The young emperor was either killed or drowned, and China was now fully under Mongol control for the first time in history. Kublai's reign brought remarkable changes. The Yuan dynasty integrated Mongol, Chinese, Persian, and Central Asian administrators into a complex bureaucracy. Kublai introduced paper money on a wide scale, reformed the taxation system, and built roads, canals, and postal stations to better unify the empire. Trade thrived under the Pax Mongolica. The Silk Road was safer than it had been in centuries. Goods flowed in both directions, silk, tea, and porcelain to the west, glass, spices, and gems to the east. Cultural exchange flourished as well. Astronomers, doctors, and engineers traveled freely, sharing knowledge from Baghdad to Beijing. Yet despite these accomplishments, Kublai's Yuan dynasty also showed signs of strain. While he adopted Chinese customs, he continued to favor Mongols and other Central Asians in government positions. Native Han Chinese were often excluded from high office, leading to resentment and a sense of alienation. Religious tolerance remained a hallmark of Mongol rule, and Kublai welcomed Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and Taoists at his court. But this pluralism, while progressive, also created tensions between competing religious factions vying for influence. The grandeur of Kublai's court dazzled visitors. Marco Polo, who spent nearly 2 decades in his service, described a city of marble palaces, vibrant markets, and intricate rituals. He marveled at the efficiency of the postal system and the wealth of the emperor's treasury. While some of his accounts were exaggerated, they painted a picture of a world unlike any Europe had seen. But even as Kublai enjoyed success in China, his efforts to expand further met failure. Campaigns into Vietnam, Burma, and Java were hampered by heat, disease, and unfamiliar terrain. His most famous military failure came in 1274 and again in 1281, when he launched 2 massive invasions of Japan. The Mongol fleets were enormous, over 140,000 men in the second attempt. Yet both times, they were met with fierce resistance from the samurai, and in each case, their ships were struck by violent storms, which the Japanese would later call kamikaze or divine wind. These typhoons destroyed the fleets and saved Japan from invasion. These disasters were not just military setbacks. They drained resources and morale and exposed the limits of Mongol expansion. As Kublai aged, he became increasingly isolated. The death of his favorite wife and heir left him deeply depressed. He grew heavier, less active in governance, and more reliant on his court ministers. Kublai Khan died in 1294 at the age of 79. By then, he had ruled for more than 3 decades and reshaped the Mongol Empire into a cosmopolitan global force. Yet his death marked the beginning of a slow decline for the Yuan dynasty and the broader Mongol world. The empire that once stretched from the Pacific to the Danube was now a federation of khanates, each powerful in its own right, but no longer united. The dream of a single empire under one Khan had died with Kublai. Still, his legacy endured. He had proven that a man born on the open steppe could become emperor of the greatest civilization on earth. He had forged a bridge between East and West, between nomadic and settled, and between conquest and governance. And though the Mongols would never again achieve such unity, Kublai Khan's era remains a testament to what vision, discipline, and daring could achieve at the height of the Mongol Empire's power. By the time of Kublai Khan's death in 1294, the Mongol Empire was already less a single empire and more a constellation of independent khanates. Though they traced their lineage to Genghis Khan, these regional powers had begun to diverge, culturally, politically, and militarily. The 4 main successor states were the Yuan dynasty, centered in China and ruled by Kublai and his heirs. The Golden Horde, controlling Russia, Ukraine, and parts of Eastern Europe. The Chagatai Khanate, spanning Central Asia. The Ilkhanate, based in Persia and parts of the Middle East. Each of these khanates retained Mongol traditions, but they also assimilated into local cultures, adapting their administration, religion, and diplomacy to fit the regions they controlled. This allowed them to govern more effectively, but it also sowed the seeds of disunity. Let's begin with the Chagatai Khanate, ruled by descendants of Chagatai, Genghis Khan's second son. This region remained strongly committed to traditional Mongol customs, resisting many of the Islamic and Persian influences that had reshaped the Ilkhanate. However, internal conflict plagued it. The Khanate frequently split into eastern and western halves, each ruled by competing factions. Despite its instability, it remained a crucial bridge between East and West, as merchants and scholars traveled the Silk Road under its protection. In the Ilkhanate, the Mongols had initially ruled as foreign overlords in a mostly Muslim land, but over time, they converted to Islam, beginning with Genghis Khan in 1295. This transformation deeply influenced the region. Persian culture and Islamic scholarship flourished, and the Ilkhanate began adopting many aspects of Islamic governance, literature, and science. Under rulers like Ghazan and his vizier Rashid al-Din, the court became a center of learning, producing histories, maps, and translations that enriched global knowledge. Yet even the Ilkhanate was not immune to decay. By the mid-14th century, after the death of Abu Sa'id in 1335, it fractured into smaller, competing dynasties. Without a clear successor, the region descended into chaos. The once mighty Persian branch of the Mongol Empire had become fragmented and vulnerable. Meanwhile, the Golden Horde remained a powerful force in the west. Its capital, at Sarai, on the lower Volga River, became one of the largest cities in the world. The Horde governed a multi-ethnic population of Turks, Slavs, and Mongols, and its influence extended from the Ural Mountains to the Black Sea. The rulers of the Golden Horde also converted to Islam, beginning with Kublai Khan in the mid-13th century. This set them apart from the Buddhist and shamanistic Mongols to the east and created tensions with the Ilkhanate, particularly during Berk's war with Hulagu Khan. These tensions highlighted how ideological and religious divergence was beginning to undermine Mongol unity. The Horde maintained dominance over the Rus principalities, collecting tribute and occasionally launching punitive campaigns. But over time, the Rus began to resist. The city of Moscow, once a minor trading post, gradually grew in wealth and influence under Mongol favor, only to later become the nucleus of opposition. And then, in the east, there was the Yuan dynasty, now led by Kublai's successors. Kublai's immediate heir, Temur Khan, ruled with moderation, but the Yuan dynasty began to face growing internal resistance. Chinese resentment simmered under Mongol rule, particularly as government posts remained largely closed to native Han Chinese. Economic problems, natural disasters, and corruption all undermined public confidence. The dynasty also suffered from succession crises. Unlike earlier generations, the later Yuan emperors were often weak or disinterested in governance. Factionalism at court, combined with mounting unrest among peasants and scholars, began to erode Mongol control. By the mid-14th century, a series of famines, floods, and uprisings led to widespread rebellion. The most significant of these was the Red Turban Rebellion, a broad-based movement that united disgruntled peasants, religious sects, and former officials against the Yuan. In 1368, the Yuan capital of Dadu, modern Beijing, fell to the Ming dynasty, led by a former monk named Zhu Yuanzhang, who would become the Mongol Emperor. The Mongols were driven back to the steppes, and the Yuan dynasty came to an end. But it wasn't the end of Mongol power in Asia. The remnants of the Yuan court fled north and established what became known as the Northern Yuan in Mongolia proper. While they no longer controlled China, they continued to assert their legitimacy as heirs of Genghis Khan for centuries. Across the broader empire, the legacy of Mongol rule was being dismantled by rising local powers. The Timurid Empire, founded by the Turkic Mongol conqueror Timur, or Tamerlane, emerged in Central Asia and Persia, claiming descent from the Mongols but forging a distinctly different identity. Meanwhile, in Russia, the princes of Moscow were beginning to consolidate power. In 1380, at the Battle of Kulikovo, Prince Dmitry Donskoy led a coalition of Russian forces that defeated the Mongols for the first time in open battle. Though the horde would retaliate, the tide had begun to turn. By the end of the 14th century, the once unified empire of Genghis Khan had splintered into regional legacies, each carrying fragments of the original vision, but none capable of restoring its full glory. The Mongol world had become a patchwork of kingdoms, each shaped by its unique blend of Mongol governance and local culture. Their banners no longer flew from the gates of Europe to the shores of Korea, yet their influence endured in the roads they built, the knowledge they spread, and the empires they inspired. The age of Mongol supremacy had ended. But the story was far from over. As the Mongol Empire fragmented, so too did the singular vision of Genghis Khan. Yet, in the fading embers of Mongol rule, an undeniable truth remained. Their conquests had irrevocably altered the course of history. Even as the Khanates fought amongst themselves and gave way to rising dynasties, the systems they left behind continued to shape societies. The postal networks, taxation models, administrative reforms, and trade routes introduced or enhanced by the Mongols remained foundational in many parts of Eurasia. In China, the fall of the Yuan dynasty to the Ming marked a return to native Han Chinese rule. But it also reflected deep influences left by the Mongols. The Ming dynasty adopted certain Yuan military practices, continued to use paper money in limited forms, and retained aspects of Mongol court ceremonial. More significantly, the Ming inherited a vast, centralized state made possible by Mongol innovations in bureaucracy and communication. Culturally, Mongol influence can be seen in art, language, and architecture across the former empire. In Central Asia and Persia, Mongol patronage had helped to preserve and expand Islamic scholarship. The Ilkhanate court, under rulers like Ghazan and Oljetu, had supported astronomers, historians, and mathematicians whose work influenced both Eastern and Western traditions. In the Russian lands, Despite centuries of domination by the Golden Horde, the Mongol period also contributed to the rise of Moscow as a centralizing force. The Mongols had favored Moscow's princes as tribute collectors. This elevated Moscow above rival cities, enabling it to eventually lead the resistance against Mongol rule. The methods of taxation, census-taking, and governance developed under Mongol influence would form the administrative backbone of the later Russian state. The Chagatai Khanate, which endured longer in Central Asia, experienced a unique evolution. While it began as a conservative, traditional Mongol state, it gradually absorbed Turkic and Islamic culture. Over time, Mongol identity in this region fused with local traditions, contributing to the rise of Turco-Mongol dynasties, such as the Timurids and later the Mughals in India. Indeed, perhaps the most visible continuation of Mongol influence would come in the 16th century with the Mughal Empire, founded by Babur, a descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan. The Mughals brought Mongol-derived military tactics, steppe court culture, and a strong, centralized administration to the Indian subcontinent. Their empire became one of the most powerful in the early modern world and a direct inheritor of the Mongol legacy. Beyond political systems and lineage, the Mongol era also reshaped global trade and communication. The Silk Road, safeguarded by Mongol law and patrols, allowed for an exchange of not only goods, but ideas, religions, and even diseases. The most infamous of these exchanges was the Black Death, which historians believe may have traveled along trade routes from Central Asia to Europe in the mid-14th century. Though devastating, the pandemic was a byproduct of the Mongol-facilitated global network, a stark reminder of how interconnected the world had become. Ironically, the same connectivity that made the Mongol Empire powerful also made it vulnerable. News of rebellion, changes in leadership, or foreign threats could travel fast, but so too could instability, dissent, and disease. As each Khanate declined, new regional powers rose in their place. The Ming in China, the Ottomans in Anatolia, the Safavids in Persia, and the nascent Russian state. All these regimes emerged from the shadow of the Mongols, often adopting and adapting what the Khans had built. And yet, in Mongolia itself, the memory of Genghis Khan remained sacred. He was not just a historical figure, he was a symbol of unity, resilience, and destiny. Shrines, oral histories, and epic poems preserved his image as the father of a nation and the ruler of all Mongols. For centuries, the Mongolian plateau would remain a fragmented land, torn between Chinese dynasties to the south and Russian expansion from the north. But even under foreign rule, the spirit of Genghis Khan endured. In modern times, as Mongolia emerged as an independent nation in the 20th century, the legacy of the Mongol Empire was reclaimed. Statues of Genghis Khan now stand tall in Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia. His name graces currency, universities, and airports. Far from being a relic of the past, he has been revived as a national hero. And around the world, historians continue to re-evaluate the Mongol legacy, not merely as a tale of conquest, but as a catalyst for global change. They see in the Mongol Empire the first real attempt at globalization, an empire that connected lands and peoples from the Adriatic to the Pacific. Yes, the Mongols brought war and destruction, but they also brought order, innovation, and a vision that the world could be bound together by more than just geography. From humble beginnings on the windswept steppe, Genghis Khan and his descendants carved out a legacy that transcended borders and centuries. And though their empire eventually faded, their impact lives on in our maps, our languages, our institutions, and our shared human story. While the Mongols are most often remembered for their conquests and military prowess, their governance, legal reforms, and cultural policies played an equally transformative role in shaping the vast territories they ruled. Beneath the image of the ruthless horseman was a deeply pragmatic state builder who understood that empires needed more than force to endure. They required order, administration, and inclusion. Let's begin with Yasa, the legal code often attributed to Genghis Khan. Though never written down in full and somewhat shrouded in myth, Yasa was a comprehensive set of laws designed to unify a diverse and rapidly expanding empire. It emphasized discipline, loyalty, and the rule of law. Penalties were often severe, reflecting the harshness of steppe life, but they were applied with remarkable consistency. Under Yasa, theft, betrayal, and disobedience were punished swiftly. Lying, adultery, and even the improper treatment of animals were all considered offences. Yet it also enshrined principles of equality within the ranks of the military and prohibited the enslavement of fellow Mongols. In a time when law was often subject to the whims of rulers, Yasa provided a form of predictable justice. One of the most progressive aspects of Mongol rule was their policy of religious tolerance. Genghis Khan himself believed in the power of the spirit world and respected a variety of religious practices, from Buddhism and Islam to Christianity and Taoism. He frequently consulted shamans, but also welcomed sages and clerics from across Eurasia. This tolerance wasn't simply an act of kindness, it was strategic. The Mongols ruled over a mosaic of cultures, languages, and beliefs. Forcing a single religion would have invited rebellion. Instead, they created an environment where different faiths could coexist, a rarity in the medieval world. Mongol rulers built temples, mosques, and churches. They exempted religious leaders from taxation and conscription, giving them special protections under the law. As a result, priests, monks, and scholars often supported Mongol administration and served as intermediaries between the Khans and their diverse subjects. In the Yuan dynasty, this policy of tolerance continued. Kublai Khan welcomed Tibetan Buddhist lamas, Nestorian Christians, and Muslim astronomers to his court. While Buddhism became the dominant influence in the Yuan court, Kublai continued to support other religions. Chinese Confucianism, although treated with caution early on, was eventually integrated into Yuan governance, helping to stabilize rule in a culturally sophisticated land. This pluralism extended to the intellectual sphere. Mongol courts became centers of learning and debate. The Ilkhanate, for example, sponsored translations of Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic and Mongolian. Scholars like Rashid al-Din, who served under Genghis Khan, produced encyclopedic histories that sought to compile all human knowledge, an endeavor far ahead of its time. The Mongol approach to governance emphasized efficiency and meritocracy. Officials were chosen based on talent and loyalty rather than lineage. The empire's vast territory was divided into administrative units, each overseen by governors who were held accountable through regular audits and reports. Communication was key. The YAM system, or Relay Post Network, ensured that messages and goods could move swiftly across thousands of miles. These stations, spaced every 25 to 40 miles, provided fresh horses and food for messengers. With this system in place, a message from Karakoram could reach the Caspian Sea in just a few days, a revolutionary speed for the 13th century. Commerce flourished under Mongol rule. The empire's emphasis on stability and free movement allowed merchants to travel more freely than ever before. The Mongols established merchant passports, known as paisi, which protected traders and gave them access to resources and lodging along trade routes. This encouragement of commerce created a vibrant Eurasian economy. Silk, tea, ceramics, paper, and spices moved westward, while gold, wool, slaves, and horses moved eastward. But more than goods, it was ideas that traveled. Printing technology, medicine, astronomical instruments, and mathematical theories were all shared across cultures. Among the most notable travelers during this period were Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, whose writings offer first-hand glimpses into Mongol administration and the multicultural nature of their domains. Polo, arriving at the court of Kublai Khan, described an empire run with a level of order and efficiency unknown in Europe at the time. Ibn Battuta, traveling through the Chagatai Khanate and the Golden Horde, was struck by the reach of Mongol law and the surprising security of the roads. Despite these advances, Mongol rule was not without tension. In regions like China, local populations often felt alienated from their rulers. Mongols retained a privileged status in many areas, while locals were sometimes excluded from high office. In response, revolts and underground resistance movements began to emerge, early signs of the unrest that would later lead to the downfall of Mongol regimes. Nevertheless, the achievements of Mongol governance were profound. They did not impose a single culture, religion, or language. Instead, they created a framework for coexistence, where many civilizations could thrive under a common banner. In doing so, they laid the groundwork for a new vision of empire, not based solely on blood or soil, but on connectivity, exchange, and the rule of law. The Mongol policy of integrating local talent into the administrative structure was perhaps one of their most pragmatic innovations. In China, Persia, and the steppe regions, Mongol rulers frequently employed local scholars, engineers, and administrators to manage day-to-day governance. This approach not only ensured smoother control of vast, culturally diverse populations, but it also allowed for a unique fusion of knowledge systems. In the Yuan dynasty, This fusion was most evident in the blending of Chinese and Central Asian administrative traditions. While high offices were often reserved for Mongols and their favored Central Asian allies, Chinese officials continued to manage local and regional governance. The result was a bureaucracy that, although criticized for its favoritism, functioned with a surprising degree of efficiency and adaptability. The Mongols also supported public works, including the expansion and maintenance of the Grand Canal in China, irrigation systems in Persia, and bridges and caravanserais along major trade routes. These investments were not just acts of benevolence, they ensured smoother movement of troops, goods, and information across the empire. The Mongol belief in mobility extended beyond the battlefield to infrastructure planning, helping to unify disparate regions. In medicine, the Mongols facilitated an unprecedented exchange of ideas. Chinese herbal remedies, Persian surgical techniques, Indian Ayurvedic practices, and Islamic hospitals all influenced each other. Under the Ilkhanate, hospitals were established that provided care regardless of religion or nationality, remarkable in an age when many societies offered medical services only within specific religious or ethnic boundaries. Astronomy also thrived under Mongol patronage. The construction of observatories in cities like Marageh and Samarkand brought together scholars from across the Islamic world, Central Asia, and China. These centers produced some of the most advanced astronomical tables of the medieval era, used to improve calendars, navigation, and even artillery. But perhaps the most profound impact of Mongol governance was its effect on literacy and historical consciousness. Across the empire, rulers commissioned histories, not merely as propaganda, but as a way to understand and preserve the legacy of Genghis Khan. These chronicles were often written by scholars of different ethnic and religious backgrounds, reflecting the pluralism of Mongol rule. One of the most famous was the Compendium of Chronicles by Rashid al-Din, a Persian historian and physician in the service of the Ilkhanate. His work, completed in the early 14th century, sought to document not just the Mongol Empire, but the history of all known peoples, from the Chinese to the Franks. It was one of the earliest attempts at global history, capturing the Mongol worldview, that no culture was isolated and all were connected through a shared human journey. In literature and the arts, the Mongol period encouraged cross-cultural experimentation. Chinese painting techniques influenced Persian miniatures. Arabic calligraphy found its way into Central Asian manuscripts. Mongol nobles often patronized poets and musicians from different traditions, fostering a cosmopolitan court culture that defied the rigid boundaries of earlier empires. And yet, this golden age of connectivity existed alongside the brutal realities of conquest and rule. For all their tolerance and innovation, the Mongols remained conquerors. Their initial campaigns left cities in ruins, populations decimated, and cultural institutions shattered. Rebuilding and synthesis occurred, but only after waves of destruction. Still, it is this dual legacy of devastation and creation that defines the Mongol era. They were both destroyers and builders, tyrants and reformers. Their empire, though born in war, gave rise to one of the most integrated and dynamic periods in world history. As the Mongol realms matured, the question of succession and continuity became more pressing. Without the unifying force of a single Khan, the empire depended on cooperation between distant and culturally distinct Khanates. While this worked for a time, it ultimately proved unsustainable. By the mid-14th century, as we've seen, each branch of the Mongol Empire faced its own challenges: revolts, economic strain, internal corruption, and rising local powers eager to reclaim autonomy. But even as the empire declined, its legacy endured. The roads they built remained. The ideas they shared lived on. The vision of a connected world, one where cultures meet, trade, and learn from one another, continued to inspire empires and thinkers long after the last Mongol Khan laid down his sword. The Mongol Empire had, in its own way, united the world. And though it fractured, the bridges it built would span centuries. As the political unity of the Mongol Empire dissolved, its intellectual and cultural legacy continued to resonate across continents. Few empires in history have had such a profound influence on the circulation of knowledge, the expansion of trade, and the shaping of language and science. At the heart of this enduring legacy was the Silk Road, an ancient network of trade routes that reached its full potential under Mongol stewardship. With the Mongols enforcing peace across vast distances, merchants, scholars, and travelers could cross Eurasia with relative security. Goods moved in greater volumes, and more importantly, ideas flowed more freely than ever before. Mongol officials encouraged this exchange by offering protection, creating resting posts, and issuing paisi, metallic passports or tokens, granting merchants access to food, shelter, and resources across the empire. Caravanserais, or roadside inns, flourished from Anatolia to northern China, creating a web of interconnected societies where Arabian horses, Venetian glass, Persian carpets, and Chinese silk shared space. But trade was only part of the story. The Mongol Empire was a conduit for knowledge. It facilitated the spread of everything from medicinal texts and agricultural techniques to artistic motifs and philosophical treatises. Chinese innovations like gunpowder, printing technology, and the compass made their way westward, while Persian and Arab advances in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine traveled east. One striking example is the development of astronomy. The Maragay Observatory in the Ilkhanate, established by Hulagu Khan and led by the renowned scholar Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, produced star charts and astronomical theories that would influence not only Islamic science, but later European thinkers such as Copernicus. In medicine, Mongol patrons fostered the translation and synthesis of diverse traditions. Persian, Indian, Chinese, and Greco-Roman medical texts were shared and debated in court hospitals. This cross-pollination laid the groundwork for more holistic and empirical approaches to health, especially in the Islamic world. Even in language, the Mongol impact was notable. While the empire itself used a variety of tongues, from classical Mongolian and Persian to Chinese and Arabic, It necessitated the development of multilingual administration and diplomacy. This led to the growth of translation bureaus and the formal training of interpreters. It also encouraged linguistic borrowing and hybrid expressions, especially in trade cities like Samarkand, Tabriz, and Hangzhou. Interestingly, the Mongols often adopted and promoted the script of conquered peoples. In China, the Yuan dynasty used both Mongolian and Chinese script. In Persia, Arabic script became dominant, even in administrative records. This flexibility helped them administer multi-ethnic societies without imposing a single cultural standard. Another critical legacy was the way the Mongols reshaped geography and cartography. Mongol generals and administrators were intensely interested in the layout of their empire, commissioning surveys and maps that helped with military planning, taxation, and trade. The resulting maps influenced later Islamic and European cartography, providing more accurate depictions of Central Asia and the Far East. These scientific and cultural legacies were perhaps best captured by the travelers who witnessed them firsthand. While Marco Polo is the most famous, other travelers such as William of Rubruck, a Flemish Franciscan sent by King Louis IX of France, recorded detailed accounts of Mongol religious tolerance, curiosity, and courtly sophistication. Rubruck's writings highlight how Mongol rulers often engaged in theological debates, inviting monks, mullahs, and shamans to present their beliefs and defend them in open forums. Such pluralism, though driven by political practicality, reflected a worldview that was fundamentally inquisitive and inclusive, a rare quality in medieval empires. Even after the empire's decline, these intellectual traditions endured. In the centuries following the Mongol era, the knowledge shared under their rule would form the backbone of the Renaissance in Europe, the Timurid cultural revival in Central Asia, and the Mughal synthesis in India. In this way, the Mongols served not only as conquerors, but as bridges between worlds. They connected isolated civilizations, stimulated technological progress, and reminded humanity that knowledge, like trade, knows no borders. And perhaps that is their most enduring legacy, not just what they destroyed or built, but what they connected. A single empire, forged on the windswept steppes of Mongolia, managed to spark a global transformation that would echo for centuries to come. As the 14th century waned, the Mongol Empire, once a force that united the world's largest landmass under a single dominion, had faded into a collection of fragmented states, dethroned rulers, and distant memories. But the imprint of that empire, of the horsemen from the steppes, endured in every corner of the Eurasian continent. Let us take a final journey, not through battles or conquests, but through the legacy that the Mongols left behind. The most visible and immediate aftermath was in state formation. In the wake of Mongol withdrawal or collapse, new empires rose, shaped directly or indirectly by Mongol institutions. The Ming dynasty in China, the Timurid Empire in Central Asia, the Mughal Empire in India, and the Tsardom of Russia all drew from Mongol methods of governance, taxation, military organization, and infrastructure. In China, The Ming built their bureaucracy on the foundations laid by the Yuan dynasty. They revived Confucian principles, but also retained aspects of Mongol land management and census-taking. The Ming Great Wall, often romanticized as a defense against barbarian invaders, was in many ways a monument to the memory and fear of the Mongols. In Russia, the centuries of Mongol tribute and oversight left a deep administrative mark. The Muscovite state adopted Mongol military organization, postal systems, and fiscal policies. Terms like Tsar, from Caesar, might be European in origin, but the centralized despotism of the Russian monarchy bore a distinct resemblance to the structure of Mongol Khans. The Mughal Empire, whose very name is derived from Mongol, was perhaps the most explicit heir. Founded by Babur in 1526, the Mughals claimed descent from both Timur and Genghis Khan. Their empire fused Mongol martial traditions with Persianate culture and Indian administrative genius, producing a golden age of architecture, literature, and governance in South Asia. Even in the Islamic world, the memory of the Ilkhanate lived on. Persian scholars, artists, and scientists carried forward the Ilkhanid legacy, blending Mongol patronage with Islamic intellectualism. The Safavid Empire, which rose in Persia in the 16th century, absorbed many of these cultural and bureaucratic elements. Beyond politics, the Mongols left a lasting influence on identity and myth. Genghis Khan, once demonized as a ruthless destroyer in Persian, Russian, and European sources, came to be re-evaluated by historians and nationalists alike. In Mongolia, he is revered as a founding father, a unifying spirit, and a symbol of resilience. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, modern Mongolia has embraced its heritage with a renewed sense of pride. Statues of Genghis Khan now tower over the capital, and his image adorns currency, universities, and even public infrastructure. His law, the Yasa, is studied for its forward-thinking governance. His vision of a connected world is remembered not just in Mongolia, but across academic circles worldwide. In the West, scholars have shifted from viewing the Mongols as mere barbarian invaders to recognizing their role as agents of globalization. The term Pax Mongolica is now used to describe a period of peace, trade, and cultural flourishing, one that allowed for a more connected world centuries before modern communications. The world today is in many ways the child of that connected age. The modern concept of international trade, the exchange of ideas across continents, the reliance on road networks and logistical efficiency all echo the systems developed or expanded by the Mongols. But the Mongol legacy is also a paradox. They destroyed to build, they killed to unify, they ruled as outsiders, yet adopted and preserved local cultures. Their empire rose through fire and war, but it left behind a world more interconnected, curious, and complex than it had ever been before. Perhaps most profoundly, the Mongols reshaped how we understand the idea of empire. Unlike the static empires of the ancient world, the Mongols conceived of territory not as a fixed homeland, but as a space to be moved across, integrated, and exchanged. Power was not just about conquest, it was about facilitating movement, forging links and imposing structure on the vast unknown. Their story is a reminder that even the most unexpected forces, nomads from the steppe, can reshape the world. So, tonight, as you fall asleep, think not just of horsemen galloping across endless plains, or banners rising over cities long lost to time. Think of the roads that connect you to others, the languages you speak, the maps you study, and the laws that guide your life. Somewhere in each of them, a trace of the Mongol Empire lingers, an echo of a time when the world came together beneath the hoofbeats of history's most unlikely conquerors. Good night.